Okay, it's live.
All right. And then Jordan needs to be promoted.
Doing it.
Cool. Rock on. Okay, well. And then Jordan needs to be promoted.
Sorry about that.
That's right. that's pretty okay.
That's when the stream starts on my machine. So
okay, so we have several items here. I kind of want to get through the quicker ones, or the ones that were marked for mention, but I don't know if there's necessarily a ton to discuss because I think that some of this stuff could be better done in the time between meetings. So one of the first ones I'd like to look at is developer survey number 85. This may have been mentioned the last meeting too, but just so y'all are aware, there's a request to put out a developer survey because we make a lot of claims about like developers would want, and we have a lot of hunches, but it would be nice to get a feel for what developers are what their actual opinions are. So if you could contribute to thread number 85 and throw in questions or things that you would want there. I think they've also requested for the user feedback folks to pop in, but that's just something to be aware of there.
Yeah, on that front, I mean, the user feedback group, once there's a set of questions which we think is reasonable,
yeah.
right now there's can help get that actually out, but it's up to our group to put that list of questions together.
Ah, okay. Right now, it looks like there hasn't been any real activity on that thread, so I would encourage you to participate if you have questions that you want to see, like what users think of X, Y, or Z. So feel free to pop in there and start discussing that. All right, the next one. Last meeting, we started an initiative to document terminology and historical decisions, and that thread is still ongoing, and that is 119, so 119, and that was by S-Modal. And there was a lot of activity. I haven't been following that. If anyone wants to do a summary of that, I would dig it. Let's see. I think we might have one of the speakers here. Do we have anyone raising their hands? Nope. Okay. Well, I would say go, and if you want to help on that effort, there is a lot of activity on that, or at least there was 7 days ago. And there's another draft thread being produced in a document. So that work is ongoing too. I don't know if there's anything really to discuss there. It says an agenda item, but that was 14 days ago. That's just probably to let you know that they're working on this, and so contribute, please. Next up, we have, okay, so now we can get into things. There is something we do need to discuss. I don't know if we have quorum yet. Let's look at how many. We have 13. That's not even enough. So we don't have quorum. There is an item for warning when user imports a module with a venable namespace. The issue 20951. I think this might just be for visibility. I don't know if we actually have to vote on this one because it's the existing thing. We have a rule where we're not adding new features, but this is like a debug enhancement, so I'm not quite sure how deep this goes. But I would say if you're not familiar with it, please pop in and give your opinions on the thread. If you think this is something that we should do or not. If you think the sniff or inference for it needs to be tweaked, please pop in. I've reviewed it. I'm for the change. I was hoping it would have made more progress in the TC39, and so when it didn't, the tooling is the natural fit for it, the natural fallback for it. So either in browsers or in Node, it's a good way to let people know that there's something that they could be stumbling on. If you're not familiar with the issue, is that if you have a dynamic import and the namespace that you are importing has a binding for then, dynamic import will defer to the then and pass through. And lots of times, if that then wasn't intended to be a promise resolve, it could just be a silent execution. And so that's probably not what you want. And so that's why this pull request would shoot off a warning and let you know that you have potentially done something you did not want to do. So there's that.
It does seem, though, that in the issue, some people are asking that there's effectively a vote on it. So.
Oh. Well, we can't vote yet.
No. Just as a heads up, that's all I wanted.
Yeah, yeah. But well, at least I don't think we can.
Not if there's not enough people here. And
how many do we need?
I believe we need 14. Hey, Bradley, you're raising your hand.
Yeah, so some added context to this. I made a PR to ESLint last year. They didn't see this behavior as problematic, and TC39 also doesn't see the behavior as problematic. So if you have use cases or counterexamples for why dynamic import and export function then should work without warnings, please post those in the issue. Don't feel that you have to succumb to people thinking that it's odd behavior. If you have valid use cases, please list them so we can discuss.
Yeah, Guy.
Yeah, if you follow the discussion on the repo, there was a bit of back and forth around some of these things, and there was a revision halfway through that it will only warn if the then function has no arguments. And I believe that's what's implemented at the moment in the PR. So if you write a then function which potentially won't resolve, and it's kind of trying to avoid that pausing behavior, I think. But there's a lot of discussion around that on the PR there.
Jordan. You're muted. Jordan?
I have a pretty good idea what he's probably going to say, because I've had a discussion with him similarly about this.
1 second. I think, can you, Jordan, we can't hear you.
Still can't hear you.
Yeah. Do you want to try to reconnect or
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can.
Yay.
Yep. All right.
Okay, I'm not sure what happened. Sorry about that. So yeah, basically just I appreciate that the narrowing down, I think avoids the warning in all the legitimate use cases. The only edge cases that are left, which we may decide we're okay with, are REST arguments or the arguments keyword. So there are still ways that someone could use a then export function and not declare any required arguments, but still accept one and resolve appropriately.
That's also true for default arguments.
Yes, also true. Yeah, that's right. So any defaulted or REST or implicit through the arguments keyword arguments would be the edge cases. And we can decide if that's okay. Maybe it is, because it is kind of weird to do a then function anyway. And the simple solution would be just make a required argument and you won't get, cause the warning to happen. Anyway, just wanted to call that out.
So with this, does anyone have a strong opinion against this? Keeping in mind this is experimental.
Can I interject?
Sure.
I may be a total idiot here, but I understand that because we're exporting it then it looks like a promise, but why not just return and export it then and that's it, not treat it as a promise?
The language doesn't allow that.
Where?
Import paren uses the promise resolve algorithm and the effective reality means that it is impossible to ever get anything venable, like get a promise for anything venable, which means that the thing you get, if you await an import paren, the value you get will never be venable according to the spec requirements.
And that's baked into the spec.
Yes, and Gus wrote up a proposal that I presented at TC39 last month. The hope was to have a symbol.venable or symbol.unvenable or something, basically a kind of non-magic way to exempt module namespace records from ever being considered venable. And the committee reaction was a combination of acknowledging the web reality that people are already having venable modules, and then also acknowledging that there are some legitimate use cases for them. And, you know, it kind of seems like that we might have banned the name then as an export had we thought about it years ago, but like that now the ship has sailed on that. So the current status of that proposal is that it is still stage 0, but I'm probably, you know, going to have to drop it to withdrawn or rejected as soon as, you know, unless I can come back with something, you know, with a solution that is amenable to everybody.
So if there's a valid use case and we're going to warn about that?
Right. Well, so that's kind of the other question about this. The warning is like, but so the valid use cases though are largely like if you want to export a promise from your synchronous module, you know, from the regular import of your module, but you don't want to have to do that from the asynchronous one. Or it's if you, like one of the common patterns with import paren is that you then have to do .then x or x.default because you want to kind of abstract over the Babel interop that sometimes leaks out through packages. You could make a then function on your module that would do that for you or for the consumer. So like that's one possible use case.
Right. No, you may have misunderstood me. I'm assuming that there's a valid use case, but what I'm saying is that if there is a valid use case, we will be warning when that valid use case will happen if we accept warning, which sounds weird to me.
Right. Well, and the current state of the warning, which is only warn when the then function has a dot length of 0. That addresses all, like that exempts all the valid use cases from warning, except for the edge cases I mentioned earlier, which is REST arguments, default arguments, or someone who uses the arguments, you know, arguments bracket 0.
No, but what I understood, there's a valid use case for them without for having it, you know, like a venable, if I understood correctly.
Yeah, but I think there's not necessarily a valid use case for having a then function that takes no arguments and yet still behaves correctly as a venable.
Okay.
You won't be returning the result. All right, so I'm going to call on Jeremiah. He's had his hand up.
So this really sounds like a spec bug to me. I just wanted, so if we're going to make a decision, please just make sure that the question that what was being decided on, the question that's asked is clarified quite a bit, because I think there's some misunderstanding about what's going on here.
Oh, okay. Also an update, we do have quorum now. We have 14 users. I actually miscounted Wes. There's 2 users for Wes. So we do have quorum, so we can make decisions here. So it sounds like there is still some clarification. Oh, also joined the call too, Benjamin did. Great. Sounds like there may need to be some clarification. Can we promote Benjamin?
Yep. Sorry, let me do that.
No worries.
Done.
Are y'all comfortable on voting? Not voting, but agreeing to this today, or would you like more time to review?
I wouldn't be able to vote one way or the other yet.
Okay.
This is what I asked about. What exactly are you asking us to agree on?
The pull request to add the debug or the warning for when there is a venable namespace without a length.
As in if we approve it?
Yeah. So that's what that is. That's what the issue is, Guy.
Yeah, just to maybe clarify a little bit, I think the behavior that Gus was trying to warn about here was the fact that Node would just hang and then quit, or that he didn't like the way that it was exiting the process or hanging up on that promise. So just to make sure that there's some kind of warning about how that completion came to be.
So we might be able to do this in a more productive way, which is we could discuss coming to an agreement on whether we should have debug for a scenario or a warning for a scenario like this to begin with. And then we can bike shed in the pull request itself the specifics about the warning and how it exits and all of that stuff. Jordan? I'm sorry.
So, oh, go ahead.
I wasn't sure if I didn't see the order, so I apologize to Jan or Benjamin if it's out of order.
If they want to go first, go ahead.
Yeah, Jordan was first, or before me.
Okay. So it occurs to me actually after I just heard that explanation that I remembered a thought I had about this warning is that the behavior of Node just hanging when you do import parens, that's what already happens if you have a never resolving promise, like things just hang there. So like I kind of also do feel like maybe if we're going to warn on forever pending promises, then we should, on one case of it, then we should either warn on all of them or none of them. And it seems kind of weird to treat import paren as special there.
Okay.
I might feel differently if we had top level await, perhaps, because that's slightly different, depending on what blocking semantics it ends up shipping with. But the general case of import paren is just any async function, any function that produces a promise could produce one that never resolves, and that's just the way it works.
And that could be, so what you're saying is that could be tackled more generically than just on the import case.
Right, and then the consumer who wants to handle that can already do so and is encouraged to by using promise.race and racing the one that never resolves against the timeout, like a set timeout promise that resolves after 10 seconds or a minute or however long they feel like waiting. Like that's like the established pattern for dealing with a promise that might never resolve.
Okay. Jan?
Yeah. So what I wrote as a last comment also on the issue is that right now I would more or less object to the pull request just because it seems like a weird use case. Like it sounds like someone was playing around with the boundaries of the spec behavior, ran into this based on a very on a constructed example and then solved it based on an abstract constructed example. So I don't see any mentioning of a real world application where this happened and then this solution solved the problem for a real world application in a way that made sense for that application. And so that's why the current solution, also coming back to what was just said about whether this is a problem with the node is just hanging because of a pending promise. Like, if we would have a real example of a real app where this is an issue, it would be easier to say whether this is a good solution. Right now, it just seems like implementing a solution because we can without actually having a fully fleshed out user story of what it supports.
Okay. Benjamin?
Yeah. As I was just joining the call, it sounded like Jordan was explaining such a use case, but maybe it was too unconnected to like an actual concrete example of an app. I can say what I said in the TC39 meeting about such a use case, which is just that it is like fairly unergonomic to have to use dynamic import and then access a property of the module namespace objects, probably like default, and then have another then and do something with that when the corresponding static import syntax is just import identifier without curly braces from module specifier. So I don't know. This behavior has been shipped and like works in several browsers, and It would be strange to pull it back, but I will grant that it does seem like if we were going to warn about it, doing so in the zero parameter case is would not trigger the warning in most of those cases, and it would be obvious how to get the warning to go away by just adding some arguments to the then function. My other thought was this just sort of feels spiritually similar to unhandled promise rejection warnings, which is something that Node was able to ship, and it was really helpful, and it didn't have to, it didn't really impact people negatively. It was just like some thoughtful, well-scoped debugging information that Node was able to implement unilaterally without violating any of the spec. So, although I guess there was definitely some spec discussion of how to support that. So, it seems like an opportunity where Node could add value, and then also it's just a warning. We could stop warning in the future if it's really noisy. So,
okay,
yeah, that's it.
All right, so based on the feedback, I think we might go to the thread and suggest that it be made more generic, similar to the unhandled promise rejection. And then if it will exist at all. And then that way it's actually out of the module realm and more into promises in general. And the way promises in general are handled if they're non-resolvable. Wes.
So I'm using this new tool called Big TS Query, which allows you to just query TypeScript source files on GitHub. I know that it's not it's not all JavaScript files, but of function declarations that are exported, named then in ES modules, none of them we seem to have found 4, and only 2 out of 4 of them actually seem to take callbacks as their first parameters. So I don't think this is a very common thing overall. It also, 2 out of the 4 cases, so I guess 50%, you don't really want to extrapolate on that number, but actually could exhibit this behavior that you have in mind, or the behavior where you end up with a thenable module.
And one of them enqueues the thing that you pass into an async queue, so it might take a callback, but that callback's not doing what you hope.
Yeah.
Okay. So this sounds like we should, if you could follow up on that thread with your findings. It sounds like we're not going to be able to make a call today, but I think that participation in the thread would be helpful, especially if we can make it more generic or apply to more areas than just an import. Let's see. Ben, was your hand ever released, or did you have a new comment?
No, I should have lowered my hand, sorry.
Okay. Okay, well, I think we can move on from there. Please feel free to go into the issue and provide the feedback that we've just done here. And we'll see if we can move that along, maybe in a less targeted way, in a more broadly applicable promise way. Okay, so the next item is all right. We have points of discussion for transparent interop or non-transparent interop or use cases. I think there's a couple of new use cases that we might want to go through before we get into the other discussions. So what are y'all's thoughts on doing that to the use cases? Okay, all right. Well, let's look at the use cases thing, number 55. And then we can look at the use cases document, which is linked into there. Let's see. I think this might be relatively quick. So we have smodal. Is smodal on the call? No. Okay. It says, well, we might actually want to skip that then if they're not on the call. Let's see. Miles is not on the call.
Did we do 50 and 51?
We I don't know. Jordan?
Yeah.
These are yours.
Oh,
Do you want to go over 1551?
Yeah, I don't have the document pulled up. I'll try and pull it up, but the gist is someone asked for use cases for like ensuring that the code that when you import, like ensuring that things are synchronous or at least appear synchronous.
Okay.
So I kind of threw these use cases on there to attempt to cover that. Let me see if I can jump to it. There we go. Yeah, so the first one, it was about somebody wants to initialize shared state, let's say a database connection or a cache or an auto-incrementing unique identifier. And that module is in CJS. So there are many examples of this in the ecosystem and in people's apps. The state must be initialized prior to all the other JavaScript code running, like the database needs to be connected, or the auto-incrementing ID needs to be set to 0 or whatever. So the current entry points all require this kind of initializer at the top line of the file. And they have the current guarantee, which is that that code will evaluate before line 2 of the file. And so they want to migrate one of the entry points to ES modules, and they want to change that required to an import. And they also don't want to have to modify the other entry points. So the other entry points should continue to be able to using require init, and they don't want to have to modify the init module. So this does vaguely override with or overlap with the transparent interop, but only in the sense that when you migrate the entry point to ESM, you'd have to migrate that require to import because of the ordering of import statements. But the general gist of that is a module. There should be a way to have a singleton shared between CJS and ESM, and the initialization order of that singleton needs to be guaranteeable by the person writing the consuming module. Does that make sense? Anyone who has any clarifying things on that, or a better way I can phrase it?
Sorry, which issue is this?
Number 50 of the use cases.
For me, its order is significant.
Yeah, order is significant. The extra details are just trying to set up the scenario. So, but yeah, it's the order is deterministic is really more like the use case is that it's significant and that it needs to be deterministic to make that so. I guess.
I would say this could be improved if you add the database connection example to the use case. I think that makes it a lot clearer to me what you're intending here.
But
Sure.
Isn't a database connection it doesn't have to be async anyway?
So it may be itself, but that's kind of irrelevant because the singleton could be a promise for the database, right? Like it's more that we don't want to initiate more than one database connection. So some single module has to manage that and know that there's already a current async task to initiate the data, and you could do that by having it export a promise. You could do that by having it keep track of when you call a function, it knows if the database is ready or not and queues it up,
Right.
Things like that.
Right, but whoever needs that singleton, that promise, will import it and get it before the others, and that's fine.
Well, it's not always a promise in the existing ecosystem. So, like, redundant connections often don't export promises, but you can set up a database connection that just queues until you establish a good connection to your database. It handles retry logic and all that. So we're not talking about things that are always async. Sometimes you get access to a real class instance that manages all the async state for you.
And the other thing, maybe database is distracting. I just added another one, which is requiring a polyfill. In other words, synchronously mutating the global environment, and everything needs to share that.
Okay.
And you don't want to do it twice.
That makes more sense.
Yeah. Or replace the database with the incrementer thing you had, like a function that just returns the next integer. Presumably that's synchronous.
Sure.
All right. Did you add that? Pardon. Did you add that? Okay, you're adding that. You're actually automating.
I'm adding that to the use case doc. Yeah.
Okay. So I went ahead and added this to the features of transparent interop, and then in parentheses I put order is significant.
Cool.
Right.
And I'm happy to make that more clear in the future. And please feel free to comment or whatever, let me know and I'll tweak it. The main issue is that, the order is deterministic and significant.
Number 51 is essentially that as well.
I think it's more than that. The polyfill makes total sense because it's changing globals. The auto incrementer, it doesn't really matter that it's the first. It's just that whoever uses it will make it the first. So it doesn't have to be the first to be imported because whoever imports it first will get that anyway.
So I'm going to actually, even in the database example, it still matters because you still want to start that asynchronous request immediately so that it might have a performance impact. So for example, even if you're initiating, like if you're the thing that starts your node servers, your node server, if the first thing it does is tries to start connecting to the database, that's going to make your app start a lot faster than if other code, JavaScript code runs before you've even fired off that request. So I think even in the async case, it still makes sense because like in the same way as it's really critical to be able to stick a script tag at the top of your HTML page and defer it so that the browser kicks off the network request, but doesn't, block the rest of your page on it. I think in the same way, the order is significant even if it's not synchronous.
Gotcha.
Bradley?
I think we've gotten a little bit hung up on synchronous versus asynchronous library design.
Yeah, the use case tended to wander a bit.
Well, I don't think that's bad necessarily, but I just want to state that even with database connection, if you have these asynchronous objects, you may wish to configure them synchronously so that anybody depending upon you gets that configuration down the line. So ordering is still significant, even if we have these asynchronous operations. Anything that has stateful changes that require some sort of ordering, such as configuring your database connection, not actually making the connection itself, still needs to be done in order if it's going to be properly handled by anything depending upon it.
Is it? I said Jan earlier. Is it Jan?
It's technically Jan, yeah, but
okay.
All variants work for me. Yeah, so before Bradley spoke, I actually was going to propose to pull it apart into the two different questions, the order dependence and the shared state between the two different module graphs. But I think that the call to the database init function, so calling into this shared module, calling an init function for the database connection covers both, because the init function needs to have an impact on both module graph states, and you need it to happen. You need to be able to control when it happens, and it has to be predictable. So it's order dependence and it's shared state. So yeah.
Okay. I want to move on to now that we bucketized this use case and we've heard the use case. We have a little less than 20 minutes left, and we have meetings every 2 weeks, but we should start thinking about deadlines. And so that brings us to the item of issue 123, raised by Miles, and that is just so we can start to roadmap and have goals to work towards and dates to work towards. If you haven't read the issue yet, please read the issue. We're looking for feedback on this, so I will open the floor to people and their opinions on this.
So, I didn't raise my hand, I'm sorry, but my main concern with these deadlines is it feels like we're trying to solve all the use cases that we're getting in before we ship anything. I'm wondering if we can take a more incremental approach and ship things unflagged while we haven't shipped all the solutions to all use cases, because it seems like the deadline stuff, I wasn't there last week, I don't know the whole context, but there's a desire to ship something unflagged, and I'm not really comfortable with those deadline dates if we're trying to solve all the use cases we have, because we have a lot of them, and we haven't really even fully fleshed out all features, and we haven't associated features with implementation concerns, and we haven't had time to fully, get the implementation out there and test it against people. So shipping your own flag seems unrealistic at the scale we're talking about in this group currently, to me at least.
Before Jeffrey, before I get your hand, was anyone actually at the meeting last week at the summit, or?
I was there.
I was there too,
but I don't think I was in that. I wasn't in that meeting, so sorry. I was there, but not in the right place.
I was in the meeting there.
Can you give just a summary or an overview? The video still hasn't been posted, so we're kind of in the dark.
Sure. So most of it was Miles kind of giving like a rundown presentation sort of thing. And I think he did a more extensive version of that than at JSConf EU. And then we talked about a couple things, if I can remember what they all were. I did not take notes in that, unfortunately. I don't think we talked about anything like extremely extensively, or like we didn't really come into any decisions about anything. Okay. But there was some interesting talk that happened. I don't really remember that well, okay, unfortunately.
All right, Jeffrey.
I agree with Bradley that I think the deadlines are awfully ambitious. I mean, I think we can maybe treat them as like, reach goals perhaps. Like, not that like we're going to ship whatever we've got by this deadline, no matter how ready or not it is. I certainly would disagree with that. But like, this might encourage us to be like, well, maybe we need to meet more often or meet longer, or, designate subcommittees for certain issues, or, think about ways to start accelerating this process might be worthwhile.
I would encourage us to like, if we think those dates are just completely unrealistic, it's probably better to spend a little bit of effort to, refine into something that's like potentially doable, just to set the proper expectations, right? Because if we just say, yeah, we'll treat those as a reach expectation, and then some people may say, well, okay, we're expecting something to be ready then, and if we really think that that's just totally unfeasible, it's probably better to push it out a bit and have something that, might be reasonable.
Jeremiah?
Yes. Was this from the summit? Was this posted from the summit, like as an issue?
Yeah, I believe this was brought up during the summit.
Okay, yeah. Okay, so that has jogged my memory a bit. Yes, we talked about this during the summit, and this came out of the fact that if you actually look at the implementation, well, a lot of it is just implementing the spec, and we can't change all that much there if we can even. And so a lot of that work's already done, and we're just we're really just tweaking like the edges of it. So implementation wise, we're actually very far along, and if we can figure out the edges, it shouldn't be that big of a deal, more or less anyways. So given that, if we're able to nail down use cases and go through the features and stuff, then there might not be that much more work to do to push it out still, like more than these deadline or these proposed deadlines.
Okay. Guy?
Yeah, just to follow up on that issue that was also tracking next steps from use cases and, focusing on prioritization and narrowing the focus of features to what could be a minimum set of features to release unflagged. And, maybe if we are able to, work out which specific use cases and features we can really whittle down to like a minimum set of them, then maybe we can then have something that we can assess and more realistically determine if that can work to the deadline. But if we can cut it back in terms of There's always extra features that can be added later that are backwards compatible. So then it might be easier to see what the approach looks like there.
Right, like release
then,
with a minimal set of functionality, and then
and then just having those discussions of going through those use cases and saying, do we definitely need this by that deadline, and kind of trying to whittle down which ones fall under that and which ones don't, and almost being quite aggressive with it.
Jan?
Do you call me? Okay. What I was going to add was that if I remember correctly, the deadlines that we have in this issue now were really just a ballpark brainstorm result of a 5-minute discussion during that summit meeting. So I don't think that the dates themselves are the important thing, but I do believe that having dates, or at least using these dates as a starting point for working backwards of, hey, if we would want to get it done by Node 11, what would it take? Like, what would need to happen by when? And if we go through that exercise, I think we can either figure out if it is or isn't realistic, or at the very least come up with a expectation that we can communicate to the outside world. Because the last known thing that I know that we talked about was that modules would land in Node 10, and that is the last thing that anybody said publicly, as far as I'm aware. So I think getting to an understanding and communicating out a realistic timeline would be valuable.
Okay. Jeffrey, your hand has been up for the whole time. Do you have something more to say, or is just you didn't?
Sorry, I already spoke. I don't know why I didn't go down.
Cool, no worries. Okay. Dates are important. It gives us something to aim for. It allows us to, like you said, work backwards as well. I share Bradley's concern too. So I think what we should do is, we're not going to be able to solve this in 5 or 10 minutes, but we should go into the thread and discuss this to see if we can iron out that we agree that dates are a good thing first, and then we can start to whittle down like what those would look like, and what a minimum shippable, unflaggable thing is. There's other things we'll end up discussing as well, but that goes around the details around it. So like as Jeremiah mentioned, that we have the core functionality, import, syntax, and all of that stuff in Node. It's just going to be the dressing on top of it, like how it's consumable, how it's consumed. And that brings us to transparent or not interop. I believe we started to get into this last week as well. There's also the interoperability with importing CommonJS as well, which are both two sides of the coin. So we have non-transparent interop and transparent interop. If you haven't read up on them, I encourage you to do so. It will end up being a critical decision on the dressing bits of the ESM consumption. So it affects how you consume ESM and how that works. I think we have Jordan's hands up.
Yeah, so the discussions around that on GitHub have been very ranging. So I wanted to kind of distill it down to, first of all, it doesn't seem like anyone objects to transparent interop being possible by custom loaders or something, implementation details to be figured out later. The real contentious part seems to be, number one, should interop be transparent by default? Meaning, should you, without any extra configuration, be able to import CJS and require ESM? And then the secondary question to that is, only if yes, and until we decide yes, we shouldn't bike shed it, then should you be able to get to import named imports from CJS files? And so what I would be great if we could establish some consensus on is yes or no. Do we want transparent interop? So first, do we want transparent interop to be possible at all? I'm assuming the answer will be yes. And then the second question, do we need transparent interop to be on by default? And if we can get consensus on that, then we can focus either avoid or focus on the named import bike shed.
Okay. Bradley?
Sure. So I just want to bring up that there is an order of evaluation issue if we don't have transparent interop. We talked earlier in the meeting about how order of evaluation matters for some use cases where you're setting up state either globally or some shared object. If you don't have transparent interop, static imports will always execute before any ability to require a common JS module. And so my 2 cents here are we need it to be on by default just because we want people to be able to reliably execute things in whatever order is required for their use case.
Okay.
I don't have a strong opinion about how we do it, but importing via the static import keyword seems necessary for a variety of other things.
Okay. Before I get to Jan and Jeffrey, I thought something that Jordan said, and Gil, something that Jordan said made sense, and it's something that I think we could reach consensus on, which is, do we want transparent interop to be possible some way? So not by default, not by not default, just
necessarily, right?
Just some way. I think that I don't think we've actually had a call on that, and I think that is a decent one. So, and we do have quorum. Does anyone object to having some way to have transparent interop?
The way the question is phrased, me too.
Pardon? All right, we have a lot of people with their hands up. People with hands up that are not about this, could you lower them for a second so I can see? Okay. So, Jan?
Yeah, so for me, that question as asked implies that there is a way to require ESM using something like a custom loader, which for me also means that there's a way to synchronously get a module or the exports of a module, which I think is a pretty fundamental constraint on our implementation and features we can add in the future. So the question as generally for both directions, should transparent interop definitely be possible? I would object to that.
Okay.
Can I ask for some clarification? Just when we're talking about transparent interop, are we talking about requiring ESM currently, or are we talking about importing statically CommonJS currently? Because these are two different topics of transparent interop, and they get bundled together under this term. So I just want to know if objection is on both sides or just one side. That's it.
Jan?
My objection was for the requiring ESM side,
okay.
That side of the transparent interop.
Jeremiah?
Yeah, my understanding is we're discussing both, although I still don't think that that resolving ES modules to require is actually, in a way that doesn't return a promise, is actually like possible to really implement.
Whether it returns a promise or not is an implementation detail.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, one of the things that we talked about with the V8 implementation of top-level await is that the export namespace would actually always be returned as a promise from the V8 API. So it's not really, if that happens, then that's not really a question of our side anymore.
But that makes it exactly the same as a await import. So I mean,
I can export default a promise. I can module.exports equals a promise. So it would be transparent between that CJS module and an ESM that's both being required. So I still see that as an implementation detail that we can
Well,
address.
no, even if
separately.
you don't use async await, it would still return a promise. Like every
Right.
import would return a promise. So if you try to require it, so what you said was that from the CommonJS side, if you would require a module and you would always get a promise, even
correct,
the promise of the namespace that would count as
promise of whatever. Yep. Yes, because then I could refactor it to ESM and export default a promise too, and the API would work the same. That's an implementation detail, and whether that's something we like is something we can discuss later. But I think
I disagree. I disagree that that's an implementation detail. It's a really big user experience problem. If modules that aren't really intentionally exporting promises as the root object start exporting promises because of implementation details, which in ES modules it is, and then you start requiring promises,
I want to back up just a little bit.
You're going to get errors from it, but it's not going to be in a way that users can actually tell what that is well.
So we're getting into details about possible variations of transparent interrupt, but more generally, allowing a form of transparent interrupt. Do people have, like, not by default, but like loaders? With loaders, you can do anything. But do we have that without getting into if require should be able to do this or not, but just having transparent interop as a way through a loader functionality, or by default, not specifying either one right now, but just saying having it be a possibility. Gil?
Yeah, we have like
1 minute.
minus 30 seconds. Can I interject? I think transparent interop is the most important thing this group should be talking about. I would love to dedicate the full next meeting to talking about it in breadth and in full.
So I think something like that is needed, but also we might want to be careful about scoping, because transparent interop is a pretty large umbrella. And so we'll have to be careful how we divide stuff like that up. But I would say that's not a bad idea to open an issue on and propose for next meeting that we can discuss this, because the other side of that is non-transparent interop, which needs its own level of meeting too. Jeremiah.
Okay, so yes, I certainly think that some level of transparent interop is important, but I don't think that it necessarily needs to be equal on both sides.
Okay. Guy?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it quick as much as possible if we can, try and be super clear with this terminology, because it does become a very loose term. So maybe we should think in terms of one-way or two-way interop. And then also from the CommonJS side, are we talking about requiring ES modules, or are we talking about other mechanisms to load ES modules? Because in the current implementation, it's already possible to use dynamic imports from within CommonJS to load modules. So is that also considered a transparent?
Okay. We might be able to also have that in the thread whenever we discuss having a meeting about that. Jeffrey?
Yeah, I'd love to have a meeting all about this. I'd also, something I was hoping to get out of this meeting was to just unblock development in general, because I feel like a lot of the discussions that people are having both on these meetings and in GitHub is basically, no, yes, that's possible. No, that's not possible. Yes, that breaks spec. No, it doesn't. But you never really know until you try it. And we need to get people out there writing code. And I think we should, I'd love to try to get us figure out a path forward for that. And I would have proposed something, but we're already over time. So I feel like I should just stop now.
We are over time. And I did want to mention that that there was a couple of places during today's conversation where that could have been fit in as well. But I would say that if you have a direction that you're wanting to see where something goes, there is Node's implementation to base yours off of if you want a starting point, or NPM's proposed implementation as well, which has more code for you to work on as well. And I would encourage you to start digging into that and start trying to write the implementation. So it's not just theoretical and discussions about like what if this and what if that, you can actually throw code at it and see how an implementation would perform under certain situations and conditions.
So I'm going to actually have to drop off. I'm just not sure if that's going to kill the meeting. So
Okay.
I thought I'd give you a heads up before I push the button.
Okay, I will say
Okay.
we have gone over, but please continue this discussion inside an issue, and I think we should open an issue. We have an issue for a transparent interrupt, but it's probably clouded. We should open one just for the agenda item for next week to discuss it more thoroughly, and we can start to flesh it out there. So I'll say thank you all for coming and for your input, and we'll continue this in the group discussions. Cool.
Great, thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.